Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 6. It's all over, Corporal. Glasser dragged his father out of the chaotic mess of swinging swords and shouting men. A pile of ash built up behind the colonel, slowing his son's efforts as he was hauled over to a cluster of rocks for shelter. The captain laid his father down and patted his cheek. Father, what's wrong with you? Come on. It was just a poke in the shoulder. Colonel, up. The captain shook his father's shoulders, but his eyes wouldn't open. Come on, you need to tell me what to do next. This wasn't according to plan. What happened? Father, please, wake up. The captain tore open the colonel's jacket and pulled it down to examine the injured shoulder. There was only a remnant of the small arrow which the captain had broken off when he reached him. But something that small couldn't have caused his father's current unconsciousness. The captain pushed his ear up against his father's chest. His heart rate was erratic and slowing. No, the captain whispered. No. Mother always said those sausages would do you in someday. No, Father, how will I tell her? Come on, you can come back from this. Just a little heart flutter again, that's all. Come on, Father. Think of the mansions. Come back for the mansions. Major Jordan remained atop his horse, cutting down soldiers left and right. He had yet to reach his target, and no one from either side was going to get in his way. When he finished, they'd all be united, and since those opposing him here wouldn't approve of him as their general later, he might as well hack them down. 2 more men fell, then another and another, as Jordan made his way to the middle of the battle. Lek Thorne still remained on his feet, surrounded by loyal soldiers and not wavering from the effects of the bolt, both perplexed and enraged him. Thorne caught his eye and beckoned with his sword. Jordan glowered back. This wouldn't take long. Corporal Shin remained huddled behind the 2 horses he forced to lie down on the ground, and used as shields to hide him and the body of Captain Nelt from additional arrows. 4 more had fallen harmlessly around them. Shin rocked back and forth, trying not to look at the still body in front of him and trying to ignore the sounds of clashing metal. Pugga, where are you? He whimpered like a 6-year-old. Pugga, please, help me. I'm trying to, Young Pere. You have to listen. Pugga, please. Colonel Ferrum wasn't sure who he was fighting. Completely on the defensive, he fended off blows with his 2 swords, only wounding confused soldiers with yellow stripes who came after him in their frenzy. Those wearing red armbands, however, Ferrum hacked down. Someone on their side, after all, had just thwarted the most carefully planned assassination of General Thorne, and Sargon died before he could be blamed. It didn't have to be this messy. He and Glasser would have been able to save everyone, unite the world once and for all, and only 2 generals had to die. But some jumpy little Zenus ruined it all. Ferrum hoped he was suffering a slow and painful death, because now Ferrum would be seen as nothing more than another butcher. He tried to make his way to the only man whose demise would stop it all, but he could barely make out Thorne in the crowd of blades. He looked up from slashing another red-banded soldier to see a horse shoving through the soldiers, Major Jordan on top. It must have been one of his men who botched it all. Last year, Ferrum and Glasser had told him they would take care of the Thorne problem, but Jordan had scoffed at that. If he thought this was effective, he was mistaken. Jordan had eliminated his own father well enough, but this was a disaster that would take half a year to clarify for the citizens. Ferrum brandished both of his swords expertly and set off for Jordan. One of them was going to get Thorne, but Jurgis Ferrum was going to end it properly. He always wanted the gold bedroom of the High General's mansion. Corporal Shin continued to rock, sobbing quietly as he listened to the battle cries that seemed to descend upon him from all angles. Suddenly the sounds quieted. A man shouted, and a cheer arose. Cautiously, Shin lifted his head and peered over his horse. Men were thrusting their swords into the air, yelling in celebration. Evidently, negotiations were over. But what did that mean to the trembling corporal? He tried to make out who seemed to be the victor, and realized that whoever it was likely wouldn't be too pleased to see Lek Thorne still alive. Shin wrung his hands like a timid old woman, wondering what to do next. He could run away, perhaps, get on his new Clark and ride north like Pug had told him to do days ago. The village in Winds was still intact, and now that he knew Edge was all right, he could... "There you are!" boomed a relieved voice. Shin held his breath and looked up into the face of Major Gage. He gestured at him with the sword. "Someone's looking for you, and is disappointed that you missed out on all the excitement, Lek Thorne." He sniffed as he kicked Captain Nelt's body. Dead? He deserved it. Sloppiest assassin I ever saw. Doesn't matter anymore. It's all over, Corporal. Come with me, now. The emphasis on the last word told Shin he better not consider any other alternative than following the Major. He got to his feet and noticed with humiliation that his sword was still sheathed. The battle for Idemia was over, and he'd spent it cowering behind a horse with a dead man. No wonder the General of Salem was no longer in his thoughts. What a pitiful soldier he turned out to be, cowardly in every way. He marched sullenly to meet the new leader of the Idemian army and learn his fate. There was much more going on around him than he'd imagined. Nelt was an assassin. Lick may have intended to kill him. And how did Lick know about Salem? Who else knew? Shin was stupid. He thought he knew everything, but now it was obvious he knew nothing. Then there was Thorne. He'd handed him over to Sargon like lending him a sack of flour. And why did he care about Thorne? Because Thorne had promised him the world? At least he'd kept Shin safe. Until he gave him to Sargon, that is. But now it was well over half an hour, and Thorne would be dead from the bolt if it had penetrated his muscle, and Shin would be on his own. All too soon he was approaching the crowd of cheering men. Maybe it was Jordan who prevailed, and he'd remember that he recruited Shin. Perhaps Colonel Ferrum was victorious. Of all the officers, Ferrum seemed the most fair. But maybe the victor was one of Sargon's men. In that case, Shin was sure he was facing his last day. The crowd of soldiers parted as Shin walked as tall and bravely as a runaway could. He stopped abruptly when he recognized who stood in the middle. "Ready to try out the gold bedroom, son?" Blood-splattered, sweaty, and exhausted, General Thorne was grinning. Shin stared in amazement. How could he, but wasn't he? "I'm waiting for an answer, Lek. How about it?" "Sir, I... Thorne chuckled as he walked over to him. "Your old man did well now, didn't he? And I even kept you out of the battle. Couldn't risk losing you already now, could I? Sorry about leaving you in the dark about the plans, but it worked out all right in the end. Right, son?" Thorne slapped him playfully on the cheek, and the men around them laughed obligingly. Shin could only gape. To the soldiers, Thorne said, "See to the wounded." They obediently moved off to start evaluating the men on the ground. Several officers with red armbands, held by Thorne's soldiers, glared hard at General Thorne. He made his way over to them, stepping around bodies, and stood in front of a colonel. "To whom do you owe your allegiance now, Colonel?" Thorne inquired. "To the man who'll bring lasting peace to Idemia, sir." Thorne nodded once. "I assure you, Colonel, that I am that man, as the small loss of life here proves. When was the last time a battle for Idemia took less than half an hour, The colonel smiled partway. "Then my allegiance is to you, sir." Thorne nodded in approval and stepped to the next man. "And you, Major." The major stood tall. "I follow you, sir, for trying to save my general and for trusting your only son to his care." Thorne smiled thinly as he moved to the next man. Lieutenant Colonel, your allegiance. Lies with you, sir. Shin watched in fascination as each officer previously loyal to Sargon easily pledged his support to General Thorne. Why, just moments after the death of their leader, would they so quickly switch their devotion? That's when Nelt's last words came back to him. Align ourselves with whoever provides the best chance for survival. It didn't matter what someone believed, just if he held the power. That struck Shin as hypocritical, until he had to admit that he was doing the same thing, following who would feed him. When Thorne reached the last officer and received his pledge, he turned back to the group. Men, I release you to tend to the wounded. Every injured man should be taken to the garrison for treatment. In the morning, we'll send out soldiers to retrieve the dead while we officers discuss new command assignments. But Thorne, interrupted the red-banded colonel, the fort at Pools is closer than the garrison for the wounded. But the fort at Pools is filled beyond capacity, Thorne said. You see, when the mudslide came through, I wasn't about to stop until we rescued every last man. We saved over 1,000 soldiers, working tirelessly day and night to make sure all were fed and secured. That's the kind of commander I am, Colonel. I'll take care of every soldier faithful to me. He turned to Shin. Don't I, son? He had no choice but to stand at attention and say, Yes, sir. Thorne smiled tightly at the colonel. The garrison will care for them best, and I want only the best for all my men. The colonel nodded in appreciation and called to soldiers behind him. You heard your general. Bring the wagons for the wounded. Colonel, Thorne said easily, as if he'd known the man all his life. You're in charge now. I need to spend a few minutes with my son, then I'll relieve you. The colonel tipped his cap and shouted orders to the soldiers. Shin couldn't help but shake his head in amazement as Thorne fairly swaggered to him. How'd you survive, sir? And when? Thorne looked a little insulted. You seem surprised, son. I haven't been a general for so long without learning a few things along the way. I know I have enemies, Lek, he said in a quiet voice, and it took Shin a moment to remember that he was Lek. There are those who want to steal my power and make a mess of things, but I alone know how to care for the world, and it's up to me to flush out those who'd overthrow me. It's like hunting for pheasants hiding in the brush, he continued conversationally as they meandered among the dead and moaning bodies. Often you think there are only one or two birds, but on days like this you find an entire flock. Hey, soldier, he said to a body he accidentally kicked. Chin up. Someone will be by soon to check on that leg. Without missing a beat, he continued with his lecture. And sometimes, Lek, those pheasants take each other out for me. Rather efficient. Jordan, I always suspected him. But Ferrum here. He pointed to another twisted body near their feet, and Shin held in his yip of surprise. Well, he always seemed a little odd, latched on to me back in command school. It got a bit tiring playing Ferrum's best friend all these years, but he was always a faithful source of information. I knew he and Glasser would be taken with you, especially when they saw how closely I drew you in. It was Glasser's idea for the meeting at the border, wasn't it? Told you to tell me to negotiate with Sargon? Shin's eyes were huge and fearful as he nodded guiltily. To his further astonishment, Thorne smiled. You're trusting, son. That's good, but dangerous. Good for me, dangerous for you. I knew Glasser would use you, and you played the informant very well. Shin stared at Thorne. How much he knew about what was going on, Shin couldn't begin to guess. He had no idea himself. Thorne sighed as he looked at the bodies strewn around them. But no longer. We need to teach you how to pay attention to a man's eyes, not to his words, so that when you run into another man like this, he kicked Ferrum's boot, as if it were nothing more than a stray rock, and his friend Glasser, you'll know what their true intentions are. Thorne regarded the colonel's still body. I had thought a little more of him, but lust for power does strange things to good men. Not everyone can handle power as I can. That's another thing I'll teach you. It was still so puzzling to Shin that the general was even alive. But, sir, I don't understand the arrow you took. Couldn't penetrate my body shield, son, he said, thumping his chest, which made a curiously hollow sound. I'll have one made for you, too. We need to keep you protected. Shin suddenly felt very vulnerable. Sir, he said quietly, are you sure you found all the pheasants? No, I'm not. Yet. That'll be our work for the next week. Our numbers may be thinner when it's over, but those who remain will be those we can trust. I guarantee, however, there will be no officers named Glasser in our ranks. Sargon knew of their duplicity as well. That's why he was so willing to hand the captain over. Shin shifted uncomfortably, wondering if Captain Glasser was still alive, or would be by the end of the night. But something more bothered him. As willing as you were to hand me over, sir? Thorne gave him an easy smile as he led Shin from the battlefield. So that's what's bothering you? First I claim you in front of the entire army, then I turn around and hand you to my enemy? A father can tell when his son is troubled. But it's like a game of dice, son, and Sargon loves to gamble. He knew exactly what I was doing. I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand. You've played the gambling version of dices, right? There can be 2 winners in any round. You make your predictions, throw the dice, and depending on how close you were to your prediction, you take that number of chips from those who claimed you'd be wrong. Whoever throws the lucky 10 is the winner and gets the pot of winnings that round. But what about the man who happens to have the 1 silver chip when the 10 is thrown? Shin could see where this was going. Whoever's holding the silver chip gets half the pot. Thorne nodded once. And what happens when the man who rolls the 10 also happens to be holding the silver chip? He takes all the winnings from the last 10 rounds. Thorne put his left hand on Shin's shoulder as if they were ambling through a scenic countryside, not a grim bloodbath. You, my son, are the biggest silver chip any gambler's ever seen. Sargon knew that when I handed you over to him. There can be 20 men playing, yet once the first 2 rounds have been played, there may be only 2 serious gamblers in control of that 1 silver chip, waiting for the right moment. When a big stakes gambler intentionally gives his silver chip to another gambler, it's a token of intending to continue the game another time, when the stakes are higher, or even as a promise to split the winnings at the end of the night, even though that's never been my style. Tonight, Lek, not only did I give away my silver chip, but I also got it back and rolled a 10. He grinned proudly. And there was no one left with whom I had to share the pot. Shin knew he appeared disappointed that he was merely a gambler's token. Thorne gave him a comforting smile. Oh, don't be so offended, son. I've known Sargon for years. He meant it when he said he'd take care of you. We treasure the silver chips. And had things not progressed as I anticipated they would, you would have still been in an excellent position as an informant in that house. Shin was feeling dumber every moment. Thorne intended on manipulating him any way he could. He didn't even care how Shin felt, but was going to just hand him over without another thought. So you used me, sir, Shin whispered. Thorne scoffed. Well, of course I did. What's family for? You would have been fine. He waved it off. Sargon respected your grandfather almost as much as I did. He met him only a few times, but I'm sure Sargon would have been eager to have you in the same house as his daughters. Shared descendants to unite the families, that sort of thing. And the best part is, Thorne whispered, you still will be. What do you mean? The general chuckled. Spoils of war, son. To the greatest victors go the greatest prizes. Now, Sargon wasn't much to look at, but his daughters, It's been a couple of years since I've seen his girls, but I envy you, Lek." Shin stopped walking. Thorne turned to see why. Even though his mouth had gone dry, the corporal said, "What are you suggesting, sir?" Thorne pulled him along. "I'm sure when they see you, they'll be more than willing to respectfully capitulate," he said with a cold chuckle, "to your comforting them after the loss of their father. I can't imagine they cared much for him since he moved their mother from the chairman's mansion for his new woman who gave him sons." Shin stopped again. "No, sir, I won't. I'm not that kind of a man. I don't want to." Thorne paused too and scowled. "What? Why not? Oh, wait." He rolled his eyes in disappointment. "Have you never taken a—" "I have," Shin defended angrily, ashamedly, his mind filling with visions of his sisters gaping in terror at soldiers bursting into their homes. "It's just that I don't feel like—" Thorne put his left arm around Shin. "It's not as if we encourage this for all the soldiers, son. The citizenry doesn't respond well to the widespread taking of their girls. We earn more respect by allowing them to keep their land and their daughters. But certain shows of power are expected. Why else do we have females except to comfort men and birth another generation, and stitch a uniform or two?" Shin took a deep breath, begged for the influence of Salem's general, and stammered out, "Sir, may I not do this? Don't you need to earn the trust of Idamia right now? And we need to evaluate what's happening down there, then get back north and see how the forts are faring, and—" Astonished, Thorne put his hand on his waist. "You're really turning this down? Lek, I've done this for you. If it's because you have another girl somewhere, that's not a problem. She doesn't need to know. It's none of her business anyway. Do you have a girl?" Suddenly his eyes widened in alarm. "Or a baby somewhere?" "No, sir," Shin said quickly. "None." Thorne exhaled in relief. "Then let's get you a girl, or two. Most of them don't mind, you know. Men like you tend to be too much for only one woman to handle." The corporal had never been so uncomfortable in his entire life. "Sir, please," he cut him off, then tried to regain control of his face, which must have been beet red. "Please, this just isn't something I want to do. Maybe someday, but not now, sir." Thorne frowned, perplexed. "All right, son. I have to admit, the idea of my becoming a grandfather already was just a little unsettling. But," he perked up, "the gold bedroom is still yours tomorrow, and Sargon's woman and daughters will have received the news by then that they are to vacate the mansion. If, however," Thorne's smile turned ugly, "one or both of the daughters decide to linger when they see you, promise me you'll rethink this. I have a feeling once you see those girls, you might not think of anything clearly. I'll let them know they're free to stay to get to know you." As if to erase the suggestion, Shin vigorously rubbed his forehead. Something flashed on Thorne's face, as if he were startled by the movement. But he recovered himself and raised his eyebrows, awaiting a response. "I'll do my best, sir," Shin sighed. Thorne pointed at him. "And that's one more thing I want to talk to you about. When we're in front of the other soldiers, I am, sir. But when we're alone like this, I'd rather you call me Father." Shin winced, although he didn't mean to. When he opened his eyes, he could tell Thorne wasn't pleased by his reaction. "General, I'm sorry, but I lost my father only a few days ago. I'm still overwhelmed by your offer, and I don't think I can yet call you Father." The word nearly gagged him. "Again, probably someday, but I just need more time, please." Thorne sighed heavily. "If your goal today was to disappoint me repeatedly, you're succeeding, Lek. But perhaps I asked too much of you and too quickly. You're dismissed to go help with the wounded, but report to me before you leave for the fort at Pools. I want to know of your whereabouts at all times. Remember, not all the pheasants have been flushed yet." When Pere Shin Lek Thorne went to bed that night, it was well past midnight. But the overly named corporal couldn't sleep, despite his exhaustion. The evening had been too full. To watch General Thorne in action was remarkable. He issued commands, structured assignments, and integrated his men with Sargon's with such confidence that the corporal was in awe. Then Shin remembered. Taking over the world was just another day at work for Lemuel Thorne. He stared up at the ceiling of the guest quarters, wondering what his view in the mansion would be tomorrow night, and felt again like retching. He didn't want to go there, not to the place where his great-grandparents were killed, where his papa and aunt raced each other on the slick floors of the long hallways, where his grandparents hosted a dinner, where Colonel Shin put to sleep a little boy who now laid dead in the ash. If there was a way to turn off his mind, maybe some plant to chew or drink that he could take to shut down his brain for a few hours, he would have taken it, and lots of it, to forget that his life was taking him further away from all that was familiar. Then he realized that's why someone came up with the vials and mead, and why soldiers snuck them into the barracks. Idemia. He was going to live in Idemia beginning tomorrow. On the one hand, there was nothing he wanted more than a future there, but on the other, there was nothing he feared more. Yet he didn't know why. He needed a third hand with an option in the middle. Shin rolled over and wondered where he could find a vial cellar this late at night. And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.